and welcome. I'm Kira Scribner, and today we're going to get into some tea, some thoughts, some feelings, all of those things. I am a big fan of the Women's Prize. Last year, my favorite book of the year as well as my least favorite book of the year were both on the Women's Prize long list, so there can be some range. I'm really excited to share the thoughts that I had as I went along. I've already filmed the vlog and I've come back to give you an introduction because you never know when you start a vlog or where you're going to end up. And that is definitely true for this. I read 10 books. Some of the books that I thought were going to be absolute favorites I despised, and some of the books that I thought I was not even going to read are the books that I loved. So it was a real roller coaster of surprises and all of the other thoughts, and I really want to share those thoughts with you. Enjoy this video, comment as you go along, and tell me which books you loved and hated, and I will see you at the end to wrap it all up. First book that I started was The Wren by Anne Enright, and I was really excited for this. I had heard great reviews about how it deals with a complicated relationship between a mother and a daughter and their father, who is a famous poet who wrote about them, but it was never really involved in their lives. And this really intrigued me. I love the conversation about fame and how people talk about people when also understanding how they're actually feeling in the inside. And I think that that's super cool. And I love the ideas of muses and poetics and the way that that can be twisted as a good or a bad thing. And I think it's super interesting. So I went into this with such high expectations, and I am nearly at the end, and I have not been enjoying it very much, which is really sad. It reminds me of a cross between Sally Rooney and Trespasses by Louise Kennedy, which was a book that came out last year on the prize. I was expecting a really introspective, dynamic story about family and of the ways that we hurt each other and the ways that we harm each other and its legacy. And instead it's like a tightly personal story, but there also feels like there's these gaps. And I found that in Trespasses too. There's some distance between our writers. She's telling us so much of the intimate details in her life, and yet I feel like there's a wall between us that I can't quite unbrick. I feel like I know some of their like stream of consciousness thoughts, but I don't feel like I understand them as whole people. And I'm really struggling with that.
When it is raining and you park far from your house, but you need to bring library books back, you just put them in your coat.
So I finished The Wren, and I thought the end was actually really interesting. I feel like this is not a spoiler because it is kind of the theme of the book, and also it is not a story that you can really spoil because there's not a lot of forward momentum. There is just kind of thoughts and feelings and experiences. And yeah, it deals a lot with these two women. And I originally thought that it was the daughter and the mother, and then the mother's husband that was the poet. And I think that I liked it less because of the fact that it's the grandfather. So the daughter actually has no experience with him at all, and the mother has some. The story in this world is that he is a poet of Ireland, and he is of middling fame in his life, and now, many years later, he's mostly forgotten. But at the time, he was a womanizer, he was all of these things, and he wrote a lot about women and a lot about birds. And near the end of the book, the granddaughter is watching this bullfinch, and she's talking about why the bullfinch is named the bullfinch. And this is definitely a metaphor for the way that her mother, as well as the other women in her grandfather's life, were made into muses, were made into fiction, their thoughts and feelings, and how he was claimed to be this man who could really understand the internal world of women. And yet he was a crap man, and he was a misogynist. There's this beautiful quote from A Room of One's Own by Virginia Woolf, where she talks about how if people were to read fiction, we would think that women are gods because they are only to be delighted and worshipped and all of these glorious things. And then in reality, they are flung around the room and called insults. And that is the perfect metaphor for the ways in which he treated women versus how he wrote about women. And she has this legacy, and she's a poet, and she's having all of these thoughts, but how does she carry on this legacy? Should she be proud? Should she be repulsed? Should she look at this bullfinch and all of these other little birds and take away the meaning that was given them because it's not really their own meaning? The next book that I picked up after The Wren also deals with intergenerational trauma. And this is literally talked about in a moment near the end of the book, in which the narrator is talking about her and her husband, and she says her husband got intergenerational wealth and she got intergenerational trauma. And this is a really powerful novel that I really love. And it is by Alicia Elliott. I'm really excited to see a Canadian Indigenous author be really front and center in a prize like this. The story focuses on Alice, and she's a young Native woman. She grew up in Six Nations, and she's now moved to Toronto with her white husband. She has a young daughter who's only 6 weeks old, and her mother has just recently died. And there's all of these stories and thoughts just revolving around her. She's really struggling to attach to her baby and have her baby latch, and all of these overwhelming feelings of just being a young mom, and then also dealing with the postpartum depression part of that. and how you can feel just so disconnected from your child. And she's worried as a new wife and a new mother that her husband will not like her if she cannot be the best mom. So she is lying by omission, and she's catering herself to be the person that he wants. And she's feeling this level of surveillance by neighbors and by store clerks and by the people around her, that she just feels this constant pressure that she is being watched. And then we also have these times in which she's writing a creation story. She's never really thought of herself much as a writer. Her father loved telling stories, and she's always wanted to continue that legacy. But when her husband introduces her to his white friends and colleagues at the university, he props her up as this writer, and she is terrified of letting anyone see her writing, of all of these fears and worries about not properly representing what she wants. And then we also have the magical realism aspect of when she was 13 years old, she was having a boy over to the house, and before that, Pocahontas came out of the screen and started talking to her and warned her that this man was going to be like her John Smith and that she should run. I thought that the way that Alicia Elliott molds all of these elements together is so fantastic. I think that this story really represented the microaggressions that Canada has, and the way that everyone is giving land acknowledgements, giving the posture of reconciliation and of acceptance of Native people, and yet also, you know, not wanting to use the word genocide, because we don't want it to be that bad. In my review, I said that Alicia Elliott is both cutting and tender, and I think that that is a really good way of describing her, because she has a lot of tender moments and thoughts and compassion and feelings about the experiences that Alice is going through, but it's also cutting, and it never holds back on the criticism and critique of generational trauma of colonialism and racism. And it's just a really effective story that I really, really hope is shortlisted. I probably talked way more about Alicia Elliott than I needed to in this vlog, but I definitely need to give some favoritism to my Canadian authors. Since the last time we've talked, I've read 2.5 more books, which I'm really excited for. First of all, I read Night Bloom, and I was blown away. I was really happy because I was worried if I didn't like this. Like, she's an author that I have talked about endlessly about her first book, so I was like, okay, I need to love this book, and I was so happy that I really loved it. The story is primarily set in Ghana, and it begins in 1985 with these two girls, and they are cousins, Selassie and Akofa, and their stories are radically different in some ways. And it's really cool because we see Akofa's story from the time that she's born all the way until her 30s, and then we rewind and we see Selassie's story. And that might sound boring or repetitive, but the way that Amidi does this, it really doesn't feel that way, because during Akofa's story, we get a lot more of the primary information and stories, and then we get little hints of what is happening in Selassie's. And then Selassie's story really focuses on her. It doesn't have to set up all of the groundwork because Akofa's story already has done that. So instead, it just really zooms in and focuses on the parts in which they have a different understanding of their experiences. There's elements that are so radically different, and you see it from another point of view, and you go, oh my goodness, how could I not see that? And we really see how the price of silence echoes through generations and echoes through people's lives and really controls them. There's also the element of Akofa's mom, Lucy, and Lucy is a character who was really, really wounded by her family. And we see the way that plays out in the generations after her. We see a lot of Ghana and the way in which, you know, bribing and government corruption can really affect people's lives. But we also see Akofa who goes to America and sees and experiences being Black. We also see the levels of exceptionalisms and the way that someone has to be perfect and be excellent and be above these things and just continue on that grind of perfection over and over and over again. And I just think that it's a really powerful book that touches on so many different themes. My one criticism is that the ending came a little bit sooner than I would like. I would have really loved to see them interacting in the later period a little more. I feel like we saw so much build up to those moments, and then it wasn't as big there, but I think that the story along the way is so worth it. I also give a warning that the story deals with sexual assault of a minor and grooming of minors. It is on page, but it's not in page in a way that lingers or tries to like evoke this like visceral response. Obviously it's dealing with something that is horrific, but it's not written in a way that I found triggering, because we really see the aftermath and the effects of those experiences rather than trying to shock us through the actual scene of itself. And then the next book that I picked up was Enter Ghost by Isabella Hamad, and I loved this. I'm a big Hamlet fan. I love Shakespeare, and I love creativity, and I love the ways that things can be interpreted over time, and that was like at the core of this. The story follows Sonia, and she's returning to Palestine after being gone for 20 years. She was raised in Britain, but she would go back every single summer with her father and mother. Her father was Palestinian, and he was radical in his youth, being involved in a lot of political things, and her mother grew up outside of Palestine, she had a Palestinian father who died quite young, and then she was raised by her Dutch mother. So even though her mother has that Palestinian lineage, she's less involved in it. And this eventually led to her parents' divorce, which has definitely had effects on her as well. And Sonia has gone through divorce in the recent past. She's 38 years old, and she goes to visit her sister, who's very involved in politics, and she's a professor, and she also meets her friend Miriam, who gets her introduced to this play. And we really see we see her experience of being in Palestine now and being in Palestine in the 90s, and the way in which all of these elements are talked about, and the way that there's this control and surveillance that's always present. I really love this story and the gentle way that it kind of talked about these elements. Like, it's probably a little too gentle, a little too slow for some people, because it kind of weaves in and out of things, and it's not like bang, 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 but I think that it's just really powerful in that way. I also love the way that it played with form, whether there's some elements that are told like play scripts, and then there's also elements when we get introduced to the various people that are in the play, we get introduced to who they are in real life and also like who they're playing, so Horatio and also this dude. And I thought that was really cool, and it was playing on the idea of a cast list, and it was just really fun to see the ways in which she was creative. And it made me want to write, it made me want to create, and also think about the deeper meanings behind these things. And there's also that element that they're performing this in Arabic as well. And yeah, I think that it was a very textured novel that I really loved. And then the book that I'm currently in the middle of is 8 Lives of a Century-Old Trickster. And this is a book that I definitely think is going to be farther down on my list, not because I'm not enjoying it, but I'm definitely not I'm not compelled. I'm not completely invested. I want it to be over because I want to move on to the next book. Not because I'm like dreading it. It's just, it's not my kind of book. It's very plot heavy. It is very harsh in many ways. It is set partly in North Korea. It deals a lot with sexual violence and just cruelty and dirt and grime and torture. It's a hard book, but it also doesn't feel as hard because it's so fast-paced. The premise is that we have this woman who works in a senior's home writing obituaries, and there's this woman who is being put in the memory loss section, and she starts to talk to her and realize that she doesn't have memory loss in the same way, and she's telling her story. I really liked the framing device with the woman talking about obituaries and their kind of conversation, but now we're fully in the woman's life. I'm less interested in. Like, maybe the ending will pull it off. I feel like it's gonna land in 3 stars, where it's a book that I'm going to forget about, but I'm not gonna really have gripes about. Okay, this is a marvelous book prize miracle because I am editing the shortlist reactions to the Carol Shields and to the International Booker, and I get the notification and I'm like, oh yeah, what is it? And it is that the audiobook for Ordinary Human Failings has come in, and I'm so excited. It was not supposed to be in for a while, and I was really disappointed that I wouldn't get to it before the shortlist was announced, because of the fact that I am visiting my family for my nephew's 5th birthday until pretty much the day that the prize is announced. So I only have a few more days to film my predictions and finish my vlog, and I'm not going to get to all of the books. I think this means I'm going to get to 9 or 10 of the books, because I read In Defense of the Act. I need to do some catch up on the books that I read, and that one, surprise, surprise, like blew me away. I need to like rewind the tape in which I say multiple times in the reaction in which I am not going to touch that with a 10-foot pole. And then I was hearing Camila talk about it, and I was like, you know what? I'm gonna give the first page a try. And from the first page, I never stopped. I read it in pretty much 2 sittings. I was in the doctor's office, which was not an enjoyable time. I had a heart monitor, and I was there for 3 hours, and I read, and I was crying in a crowded doctor's office. It was chaotic and crazy. And then I like got home, and I just stayed up way too late and read it and just sobbed. And yeah, it was a 5-star, which is like, I love Night Bloom, I love Enter Ghost, and She Fell. Like, all of those are like, you know, like I think Enter Ghost would be a 4-star, the other 2 would be like 4.5 stars, but like In the Defense of the Act, wow, the surprise winner. And I feel like it fits into other books, like Nobody Is Talking About This, or I'm a Fan, which is like the contemporary book. But I just like the way that it was called an essay. I actually really like this because it will talk about a topic and then it will go through that. And that in my mind works wonderfully. And I just love the way that she evocatively wrote, and also was so personal, and her way to describe things. I felt like sucked into every scene, and sometimes I'd be like, oh, these characters aren't coming back. Like her university friend Harriet, which is like only really in like a chapter, but like you get such a good sense of her. Like, she is such a talented writer. And I went through the Goodreads and pretty much no one rated anything but 4 and 5 stars. Like, there was a few 3 stars and like 2 2 stars, and I was like, yeah, she deserves this. So turnaround thoughts from my first reaction. I love when I'm wrong. I also had that last year with the Booker as well as the Giller Prize, in which I read The Study for Obedience, and I was kind of appealed to it. Heard terrible reviews, was not going to pick it up. Its surprise came in, and I read it and was shocked, and it became my go-to wanting to win for the Giller, and it did, and I was so happy. So yes, this is just really wonderful and lovely, and I'm gonna read this. This is about child murder, so yeah, but I am having fun with this list, and yeah, I'm really excited. My next other choice is River East, River West, and that book has really fluctuated, in which sometimes I've been really like thinking that I want to read it, and then I'll be like, nah, no. And yeah, I don't know why. I'm worried, like, I know that it deals with rape of minor, and I think that that's why I'm like, some of these aspects, like, I love the idea of, like, looking at colonialism and looking at, like, different angles and stuff like that, and a biracial person in China, like, super cool. Also, I'm concerned. So I read In Defense of the Act as an ebook, and I'm not really a big ebook fan. Soldier Sailor is on ebook, as well as Restless Dolly Monitor, and I was like, maybe I do read them. So yeah, I could, because that one feels like it's gonna be really evocative and emotional in the same way that In Defense of the Act was. So I don't know. It's an interesting day. You always think that you're gonna go in with one thing, and then you turn around and change, and it's fun. Anyways, I will see you in a more formal wrap up.
So it's been a while since I've recorded, and I have read many books, so I'm waiting for my friend in her parking lot. So who knows how long this section will be, but I will review as many books as possible in this time. So I finished 8 Lives of Central Trickster, and my thoughts were pretty much the same. It was a solid 3-star. The end, actually, I liked better. It focused less on just like this trauma, which I think trauma stories are really important, but I wasn't seeing the humanity, and the humanity is really present in the last ones, and I really enjoyed those ones and felt really connected. And then we went back to the framing device and ended there, and I like the framing device. I'm not always a big fan of characters that kind of interweave between different generations, but I thought that her story was quite compelling, but it felt because we only saw her in the very beginning and the very end, and then we spent all of the rest of the time with Mrs. Mook, and the fact that the story didn't end in her point of view felt like it was sad. I think I will hold on to some things, but it's probably been about 2 weeks since I finished this, and I'm already losing much of the story. So it's not going to be on my personal long list, but if you like a fast-paced story and you want to learn more about North Korea or the era, like, I do think that I really enjoyed reading a book about South Korea written in English. Like, I've really only ever had those books translated, so it was really interesting to see that perspective. The next book that I read was In Defense of the Act. I think I talked a little bit in a little cut-in that I had read it, and I really enjoyed it. I thought that it was this really evocative point of view of capturing moments and thoughts, and, you know, it really explains why she thinks that suicide is a good thing. And I don't think that it's a spoiler that she kind of works throughout that process throughout. And it's because of some of the horrific trauma that she's been in, and the way that she describes and really places you in those moments. But she's also a very funny, very humane narrator. Like, I just got sucked into the narration style. I'm hoping to do a review of this, and I think that that will really show the complexity of the story and the nuances, and I really love reading quotes. And I have filmed 2 reviews for the last 2 books that I read, which was Ordinary Human Feelings and River East, River West. Those reviews will really go into my huge thoughts and all of the thoughts that I had for them, but both of them were really remarkable stories. They were the last 2 books that I read, and I really got swept into both of them and the way that they talked about really hard topics. And yeah, River East, River West is just the story of a mother and a daughter. The daughter is half Chinese, half white, but she is being raised in China her entire life by her white mother. So she's always just kind of been in and out of these things. And then it also deals with sexual assault in a really meaningful way that I thought really displayed many of the complexities of going through that and the recovery and all of those feelings around there. And Ordinary Human Failings, it takes place in the 90s, and it's the family that has a lot of human failings, and it's talking about that they all have these gaps between them, and this reporter sequesters them to try to get information about a crime that was committed. And he's not necessarily very interested in their ordinary human failings. He's really like searching to find the biggest, darkest dirt. And a lot of the thesis around it is the fact that, you know, the ways in which we hurt each other are all ordinary. They can be horrific, or they can be moments that really tear us apart, but there's all of these moments that are ordinary that lead into a life that has trauma, that leads into a life that creates distance, and I think that it's a really powerful book. In between In Defense of the Act and Ordinary Human Feelings, I read 2 other books. I read Brotherless Night, and for some reason this book took me a really long time to read and kind of really slowed down my momentum. I had a hard time placing myself in the beginning, but then about halfway through, this is about a girl who is growing up in Sri Lanka during the 1980s, where there's a civil war going on, and she wants to be a doctor, and we're really focused on her entrance exams and all of those things at the beginning, and I wasn't really relating, but halfway through she starts med school, and it's during the civil war and all of these things, and she gets drawn into it in really nuanced ways that aren't cut and dry. The beginning of the novel is a flash forward to 25 years in the future, in which she talks about how she got a letter from a terrorist and how someone would call her a terrorist. At least that's what we name people who are against us. I think that that shows a lot of the ways in which people in Asia are criminalized, and really like the way that we talk about crimes or justice there are different. And that doesn't mean that people who were committing acts that would be characterized as terrorism were innocent and that they were good. It really shows the complexities, because she is both against and understands some of the aspects. She helps them in some ways, but also feels very conflicted by the choices that they're making and the violence that is being committed. And it's a really, really nuanced thing. It also talks about feminism and global feminism and the experience of being a Tamil girl and how the characteristics around that. It's a book that I would be curious to reread someday, because I think that if I understand the whole context, I could maybe understand the beginning better, and I would have been fully immersed, because once I got halfway through, I was very hooked. But it was having all of these things and trying to get into the world that really struggled. And then I read Western Lane, and I really liked this. I've been wanting to read it since it was announced for the Booker, and I got access to it, and it was really good. I really liked the quiet way that it looked at Gobi and her siblings, and her mother has died and her father is having a lot of hard feelings. They're having a lot of hard feelings, and her aunt and her uncle want to take the children away because they don't have any children. And it's not a malicious. They have a good relationship, but they see the way that the father is struggling, but he also wants to hold on to his daughters. And there's just so many quiet ways. I was listening to Jen Campbell talk about this book, and she talks about how there's like this, it's a very insistent novel. It jumps from one thing to another, and through that it really showcases a life. And I really like that. I thought that it felt very alive in the way that she narrates these things, and it never really dwells or has poetic lines about grief. But I didn't really have a big reason that I would have rated them lower. And I tried to be more generous with 5 stars than I was in the back of the day. In between those lines, you can really see the ways in which these characters are grieving and hurting and growing up and experiencing all these things. And yeah, it was another 4-star. Like, there was a lot of books that were 4 stars on this list, and there was 2-5, which was Ordinary Human Failings and In Defense of the Act. And I feel like there's other books that could have hit that. Night Bloom was really, really good, and Then She Fell was really, really good. But they were stories that I could see a reason in which they wouldn't be 5-star. And In Defense of the Act and Ordinary Human Failings aren't perfect books either.
We have come to the end. I have finished 10 out of the 16 books. I had a really good time reading these. I want to wrap them up. I want to rank them least favorite to favorite, and talk about the one book that I completely forgot to talk about because I kind of hated it. And then we'll talk about the 5 that I have not read. Will I read them if they are shortlisted? And then I'm going to do another video where I do mini reviews and predict the shortlist. So that will be coming up soon as well. The book that I forgot to talk about is also my least favorite book, and this is A Blue Beautiful World by Karen Lord. And I think that this book could have its audience. It is sci-fi, it's first contact. It is the 3rd in a series, so it's had like a really long history. It is not a book that did anything to me. I was jumped into the world, so maybe I would have understood if I had more context. But generally, I just did not enjoy it, and I did not love it. And I wanted it to be over. The 4 lowest books that I'm going to talk about are all books that took me longer to read than I would have liked. The other books I read pretty quickly. Like, I pretty much read in like 1 or 2 sittings, or as like fast as I could. And these books took me a long time. But Blue Beautiful World is at the bottom. I talked about this book a little bit in my March wrap up, and I do feel kind of sad that this was shortlisted, because I think that it's going to get a much lower rating because so many people that don't even like sci-fi are going to rate it. I am a big sci-fi fan, and I'm a big defender. I really hate when people talk about commercial fiction, genre fiction. Like, I just think it's really pretentious, and I love fantasy and I love sci-fi and I love genre fiction, and I don't think that it's worse than literary fiction, but I think that is a different kind of story. I am a very big fan of like dystopian and the way that it can really look at society and themes, and any story that is theme-based science fiction I really, really enjoy. Books that have to do with aliens, I am less involved in. The next book that's pretty much right at the bottom is a huge surprise, because I thought I was going to love this. This is The Wren. I talked about it at the beginning, and I cut out so many of my thoughts because I was just rambling on and on about why I didn't like this book, and I was like, you know what, there's other joy in this video that we can hear about. pretty much I thought that it felt very empty. It was meandering through these people's lives without really having a sense of who they were or their relationships, and I think that it touched on themes, but I don't think that it touched on themes that weren't done better in another book, either on the list or in general. My number 8 book is 8 Lives of a Century-Old Trickster, and it is very reflective, and this is a book that I talked a fair bit about. I liked some aspects of it. I found the beginning really, really hard to get into, but as we went on, I enjoyed a lot of it. But I thought that the ending kind of let it down. I can see why it's on this list, but I think that the book that I'm going to talk about right after did it so much better, and that is Brotherless Night. This was a fantastic book that really dived into the way in which war affects us. I again struggled a little bit with the beginning, but once I got into it, I really, really enjoyed it. The next book I'm going to talk about is Western Lane. This is a book that we've been talking about since the Booker. I'm really excited that I finally read it. It didn't like blow me away, but it definitely had those really good emotional moments dealing with grief, dealing with family, dealing with all of these things. The next book is Enter Ghost, and this book has fallen a little bit in my esteem because it hasn't stuck in my brain as much. I think it talks a lot about surveillance and homeland and about art and all of these things, but the characters aren't quite as strong. Like, we have these moments of strength between especially the sisters, and we have some glimmers of that with the other family members, but I don't think that it's going to be on my personal shortlist. Like, it could be, like, I would be happy to see it, but it's not a book that blew me away. I think I had such high expectations going into it that really affected it. River East, River West is a book that took me completely by surprise. I did not expect to love it, and I didn't love Lu Fang's story, but I loved Elva's story so much that it really just, like, you know, measured up. I have an entire review in which I am going into a lot of detail about Elva's story and some of the trauma that she goes under, and why I think that it's such a nuanced, deep story about that specific kind of trauma that I think is so well done. And the 4th place I'm going to give And Then She Fell, and this is a book that I think has climbed in my estimation. Like, I knew I liked it and talked about at the beginning of this vlog about how I wanted it on the short list, but like, as I thought about it, I really thought about it more and more and more. It was a book with so many themes and so many conversations that I think are really, really important to be had, and I hope that they are had. The top 3 is difficult because I think that these books could go different ways. I have 3 different lists, and they are in different orders on every single list because I think that if I'm talking about different aspects of whether it is universal acclaim, my own personal acclaim, or like craft, they fall in different places. But Ordinary Human Feelings is a 5-star. I really, really loved it. I have an entire review that will come out in a few days. I have already filmed it, I just haven't edited it. And I talk about all of the different ways that it just talks about these quiet ways. And I had such an emotional response to it. And I thought the writing and the storytelling was just like a love letter to the ways that people have ordinary feelings. And I really love those like really intricate personal stories. I think that if you were to put Ordinary Human Feelings and 8 Lives of a Century-Old Trickster beside each other, you would see the different ways in which I enjoy stories and that I don't enjoy stories, whether it's slow paced and less dramatic but more intimate. Like, those are the stories that I really, really love. The top 2 is really hard. So I want to say that Night Bloom is my favorite because I love the author so much. I loved her first book and I was so excited to see her on here. And I don't think that it's my favorite. I don't know. It's one of the first books that I read too, so I definitely think that the other books have recency bias, so it's hard to know. But I do really love the way that it played with Selassie Zedkofa's story. I think that they talk about trauma and talk about growing up and different perspectives so well, and I really, really enjoyed this book. But we have In the Defense of the Act, which is a book that I thought that I was not going to read and just blasted. And there's just a love letter with the way that it talks about humor, the way that it talks about stories. I love that it was making meta jokes. There's this entire lawn section that's very clearly about A Little Life without talking about A Little Life. That is talking about, you know, the big gay book and like how it was robbed of the man Booker, and like, you know, they're all talking about whether it's like trauma porn or not. And I'm just like sitting there just dying of laughter. And there's like other jokes that I just love so much that I think are hilarious. It just feels like a book that is very much written for me, and I cried. I was in public in a doctor's office and I was weeping and I was like, I can't be doing this right now. And it touches on suicide and friendship and a lot about friendship. Like, I love the way that it intricately looks at friendship. Like, it's talking about like university, and like one of the lines is that like, you know, she still finds her university friends the closest because they knew her when they were like in this like such fragile period. And then it also talks about like a line in which, you know, they're really drunk and they're like, I don't remember what we said that night, but I know that it was deep. We're both awfully deep. And there's just something that's like a love letter to my kind of humor, but then it deals with complicated families and dynamics and changing your perspective and all of these other things. Like, I don't think that it's as worthy as Night Bloom or even Ordinary Human Feelings. I think those deal with scope so well, but Suicide is also scope, but also it's such an intricate novel. I don't know. And I also think that people will find it less literary, but I love that it was from indie press. And, you know, there's all of these things. Like, I need to do a review on it, but I feel overwhelmed about it. And that is my list. I have 5 books that I've not read. The Maiden does not come out in Canada, so I will not read that. I don't think that's going to make the long list. We have Restless Dolly Monitor by Kate Grenville, and she is an acclaimed author that has been listed many times. I have heard some positive reviews of this, but I have not heard an overwhelming interest in it. Then we have Soldier Sailor. This is a book that I will probably read either way. I am definitely interested in reading it, and I just need to have time to read the ebook. And I worry that either it or Ordinary Human Failings will be on it and not both, because they have similar themes of motherhood and, you know, being Irish and all of these other things. We have A Trace of the Sun, which this is a book that not many have talked about. It is not widely published, and it is a Caribbean book, which I love. It feels a little similar to Black Butterfly, which was a little bit more of a smaller book that not a lot of people had access to, but some of those books definitely get onto the shortlist. And then we have Hangman, which I've not heard overwhelmingly positive reviews of, and also it has a male protagonist, and we have had so many winners in the last few years of male protagonists, and I just don't want to see it. So for that reason alone, I think that we have many books that are really wonderful and great and should be shortlisted. So yeah, I don't think that I would pick it up even if it was shortlisted. So those are the 16 books for the long list of the Women's Prize in 2024. I would love to hear if you read these. You probably read other books that I haven't read, and I would love to hear your thoughts on them. I would love to see if you have totally different takes, if your rating would be similar. And I'm so excited to see you for the announcement of the prize on the 23rd.